Hi, I'm Sueli Kello. I want to explain to you why I've been inspired to explore materialistic spirituality, in the hopes that you can better understand the thought process behind this system. My goal since I was a teenager dabbling in chaos magic was to make the practices that were so revolutionary to me accessible to everyone. Chaos magic had taught me that different practices were suited for different people, but you could use a base religio-magical system with a lot of room for personal customization to make a broadly applicable religio-magical system. This is what I set out to do, and have been working on that religio-magical system for a few years. However, I realized that my system was not fully accessible, because it relied on comfort with religio-magical aesthetics and ability to hold metaphysical beliefs that may not correspond directly to objective materialistic phenomena. These are two common issues that hold large populations back from spiritual practice. But I wanted to make spiritual practices accessible, so I brainstormed with a friend about her beliefs and practices and came up with a spiritual system that is free of the aesthetic burden of a religio-magical system and dependent on only one scientifically verifiable belief. This is the practice of folk psychology. I want to get one thing straight off the bat. When I devised the terminology for this system, I meant for folk psychology to describe the practice of the psychology at the core of folk practices. However, in academic psychology, the term folk psychology describes the ability of people to assess the mental state of a person and extrapolate the process behind their actions. Since both meanings descend from the words in a reasonable way, and because folk psychology as a spiritual practice is typically going to be contextually distinct from the medical term, I'm going to withhold from renaming the system, having addressed the confusion here. With that having been said, let's dive into some terminology. Folk psychology is dependent on a model of the relation between religio-magical systems called perennialism, with a subtle distinction we'll get to later. So what is perennialism? Let's define some terms first. When you look at a religio-magical practice, it consists of a set of beliefs, a set of practices colored by those beliefs, and a set of goals colored by those beliefs. This is called the exoteric portion of a religio-magical system. However, many religio-magical systems rely on very similar methods in their practices, and these practices can be cleansed of exoteric ideology and moved from one system to another, taking on the exoteric properties and coloring of whichever religio-magical system it's a part of. This is called the esoteric portion of a religio-magical system. Here's where the subtle difference comes in. Where perennialism proper says that all exoteric systems draw from the same pool of esoteric practices, folk psychology only requires you to believe that there is some carryover of esoteric practices between exoteric systems, not necessarily that they all come from the same pool of esoteric practices. This may seem an odd distinction to be making, but I'm making it for this reason. Folk psychology does not look like a generalized religio-magical system, the average of all of them minus exoteric ideology. Folk psychology looks pretty distinctly like the practices of a postmodernist chaot, removed of much of the aesthetics, because that's what it is. That's what I know how to build. If you want to build a folk psychology system based around more broad sets of esoteric practices, I think that is perfectly reasonable. But I think the minimalist aspects of postmodern and chaoist practices make for a really great basis for a confluent, minimal spiritual system. Also, it molds really well to the goals of folk psychology, but I'll get to that later. There exist two populations that folk psychology was built to reach. The first are people who are uncomfortable with the aesthetics and functioning of religio-magical systems, but who still need a spiritual system to aid in personal mental healing growth. The second are people who cannot hold the types of metaphysical beliefs that do not correspond to objective materialistic phenomena. The exoteric ideologies of religio-magical systems exist as a barrier for these populations' spiritual practice. Thus, Folk psychology is built to replace the exoteric religio-magical ideology of a spiritual system with a materialistic ideology and aesthetics. The system is distinct from any other religio-magical system in that it is dependent only on one scientifically verifiable belief, namely the placebo effect. Ideally, these slaves a vastly more accessible spiritual system for the populations mentioned previously. We earlier said that a religio-magical system, which we can now generalize to a spiritual system, is built from three things: a set of beliefs, a set of practices, and a set of goals. We know our set of beliefs is materialism, and our set of practices are based on postmodernist magic and chaos magic. But what about our goals? Well, the most general reason people want a spiritual system is for spiritual fulfillment. The healthiest and quickest way to achieve spiritual fulfillment is, from my experience, a practice of mental healing and growth. This becomes the core goal of folk psychology, to give you the tools to fully understand your mind and to be able to affect it and communicate with it in a way that empowers you on your spiritual journey of mental healing and growth. Now that we know the three core parts of what define folk psychology as a spiritual system, let's examine what it looks like in practice as a preview for the rest of the series. The folk psychology practitioner's practice consists of three components: understanding the mind, communicating with the mind, and affecting the mind. All of these are done in service of mental healing and growth, informed by communication with your inspiration. To understand the mind, the folk psychology practitioner must keep a detailed record of the functioning of their thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Identify distinct feelings and perceived phenomena, even if you don't have a word for them. This record will form the basis for a constructed language which describes all of the distinct perceived phenomena you are able to identify, and how they interact with each other. Using that language, you can make node graphs of the various perceived phenomena and the way they affect each other. These mental maps and your mental language give you all the tools you need to critically break down mental processes. Properly explaining communication with the mind would rely on some terminology that I don't have the time to define in this video. It comes in three forms: dream communication, waking communication in which you reach out, and waking communication where you listen for the undercurrent. Mastering methods for communicating with your mind is crucial in refining your understanding of your own mind, and will set you up to be able to affect your mind in powerful ways. Affecting the mind is done by means of achieving various altered states of consciousness in order to embed intent into your subconscious. The intent is encoded into some symbol represented by a phenomena perceivable to one or more of the senses, such as a visual symbol, a specific smell, or a few bars of a song. The subconscious acts on that intent by means of the placebo effect, and you have affected your mind. In other words, you convince your mind it's changed, and it changes by means of the placebo effect. Done precisely and deliberately, this can have incredible effects for mental healing and growth. This is the basis of folk psychology and why I think it should exist. If you are interested in what's been presented, stay tuned for future episodes.